So many things. I mean, first of all, thank you so much for bringing all of your rich wisdom and experience and sharing that with us from your own experience, but also from a discipline who has been doing this work for how long has conflict resolution and peacekeeping been around?
About 45 years.
45 years,
People
okay.
calling it that, yeah.
So interesting. You know, when I was seeing some of these examples you had of different kind of badges, it made me think about Reddit. And Reddit did launch, like they have a lot of badges on there. Have we seen any research looking at how, you know, they're kind of very complex, it's way beyond the like button, how that's affecting discourse on the platform?
Yeah, so Reddit, you know, has a great reputation for, if you want to go there to deliberate, the structure that they're providing supports that. So, you know, exchanging views on Reddit is easier than it is on Facebook or Twitter. So it'd be cool to see some research kind of comparing. I can't think of too much research that has actually looked at that.
Research needed. Research needed.
Yeah.
And talking about Colin Rule, who I saw at your conference, which I want to talk about as well. Colin built the conflict resolution system at eBay that millions of people go through. And I remember in his talk, he was saying when he gave, you know, participants an open text box, things got escalated very quickly. But when eBay created a formed structure, like, you know, select from these 20 options, that like suddenly things were functioning very well.
Right.
And that highly structured type of interaction is very different than the very open kind of interaction that we see on most platforms.
Right, and the brilliance of that is, of course, all of us, when we feel cheated or we feel insulted, are feeling very emotional. So like having something there to coach us to be our best selves and to word something actually to achieve our goals. So often we're our own worst enemies when it comes to like putting together the words that we want to express ourselves. Most of us, I would say, need coaches on these platforms to be able to treat others with respect. And these kind of public service announcements, we could be doing so much more, not only to help the tone on social media, but also to really spread these ideas. I mean, it can move offline if people are learning them online. So I think there's a tremendous potential out there.
Have you seen any examples of it working really well, or any examples that are your number one kind of pet peeves?
That's a good question. I don't actually know. I would point to Ravi. Has Meta used any PSAs, public service announcements, coaching, or Rob, those of you with some Meta experience, has that happened? So just for the audience out there, Rob is saying that, moderators can set rules. And I think there are examples within Facebook groups of moderators with some conflict resolution training, you know, doing much more to ensure that there's some positive exchange of views, even on polarized topics. So I think that that's a good point. Yeah.
And I wonder if we're going to see large language models kind of stepping in to kind of automate some of this work that human moderators have been needing to do.
Yeah. But I think the big difference, you know, is a lot of the big platforms, they have guidelines and rules. So it's so focused on content moderation and what not to do that they haven't thought about how do you really encourage pro-social behaviors. And, you know, how do you establish the norms of smiling at people and shaking hands and like all these little things that we know to do in a dark alley at night, or, you know, just in our lives, we know that we need to signal to other human beings that we are not a threat. But we don't have ways of doing that symbolically on most platforms.
Switching gears for a minute, you shared the HP funding kind of conflict resolution back in the day. I actually went to middle school, like a mile away from HP headquarters, and I participated in a peer conflict resolution managers program, and I now wonder if that had something to do with
I'm sure it did. They funded those peer mediation programs all across the country. Yeah.
Learned about those I statements early on.
Yes. Active listening and I statements are not a new thing. We were just talking about it. It's like now there's polarization experts who are claiming these kinds of things are new, when actually we've been teaching about them for decades.
How did you get pulled into this work? Like, what drew you in?
Actually, it was sort of my brother, Doug, who went to Nicaragua in the 1980s when there was a Sandinista revolution. I don't know if you know, those of you who are maybe a bit older. Sandinistas was a democracy revolution, really, trying to get rid of a dictator, and then the Contras were US funded. And I went down as a college student, and I was volunteering in a refugee camp, and everybody in the refugee camp were Contras who had lost their land in the Sandinista land reform, which, democratized the country. And my brother was all with the Sandinistas that were, spreading literacy, starting these farm co-ops, just really incredible democracy revolution. Also had very problematic aspects to it, but really, like, working in the refugee camp with Contras, I just realized how they saw the conflict in a completely different way than I had learned about it. And I developed empathy for them and their side of the story. Even though I sort of disagreed with it politically, I realized that, just at that point I wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And I do think, justice, social justice is really important from a legal point of view, but I realized that I wanted to do conflict resolution so that people could actually understand each other across great divides. And if I could understand these Contra soldiers that I was serving in the health center in this refugee camp, other people could develop compassion for each other as well.
Love that. And maybe we even go with that and let's put technology aside. I read through some of your research around the symbols and ritual, things like people showing each other photos of their kids on their phone and how powerful that is compared to what's often studied, which is also important, but like the negotiation techniques being used. Were there any other examples of rituals or symbols that really stood out? I mean, I loved the Native American
the smudging ceremony.
The smudging ceremony that you shared. How do we do that when people, go online? Okay, now you are entering a space of peace and deliberation.
Yeah.
What were other examples?
No, and you think about the smudging ceremony is one indigenous tradition that's it goes across North America. All these different tribes use it. And what is the wisdom of something like that that's been used for probably tens of thousands of years? And they realize that the quality of the conversation is better when you really make the intentions clear from the outside. The photographs one is from Camp David when President Carter was negotiating with Begin and Sadat. And really the negotiations had fallen apart. And former President Carter, called them back one last time and just asked them to get out photographs of their children and grandchildren. And that was the transformative moment, right? That all the hard negotiation had failed, and they had to look at these children and say, we have to figure out a way forward. And it switches the mindset, right? From you're not being kind to me, or this isn't fair, to we, it's from an us versus them, to we have to do this for our grandchildren. We have to end this conflict. And then they came up with a very interesting win-win solution that I teach in my negotiation classes. It's in the book, Getting to Yes, if you want to know how that diplomacy went. Yeah.
Amazing. I love that book.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Tell us about tech for social cohesion.
Sure. So over the last few years, as the world has realized that polarization is increasing in most countries around the world, we see the rise of authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracy. A number of people here were part of a workshop that I hosted a few years ago that looked at the negative. But as I learned about Polis and Remesh and now Talk to the City, we have to figure out how to harness AI and tech for positive outcomes. And so we have set up the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion to be a space for people with peace-building, conflict resolution expertise to meet together with people from technology companies, innovators, entrepreneurs, so that we are learning, exchanging ideas. Everything that we've learned about depolarization, what can we do to help? And spread these ideas so that they can be built into affordances and into the algorithms and understanding, what we've learned. And then opposite, there's thousands of people around the world doing peace building. The UN is there, but lots and lots of community groups around the world. How do they better use technology to support and expand and scale the work that's happening on the ground? So it's really an exchange.
Awesome. I don't want to monopolize being a Plurality Institute convening that this is. Do we have any questions in the audience?
No, I can't say that I did because I thought a lot about it, trying to give better examples here. I think we need to figure them out.
Good question.
Oh yes, so Ravi is asking about the reaction buttons and the examples that I gave. Those are the kinds of things, as a mediator, when I'm mediating between different groups, I'm usually doing. I'm helping people see where they have agreed, or I'm sort of encouraging symbolic exchanges of respect, which really is active listening. So what we have found from the research is that people feel respected when they feel heard. And so in some really interesting research with Israelis and Palestinians, they had control groups, and both sides were most likely to change their mind when they felt heard by the other side, when the other side had done active listening with them. Not when they had finally gotten their point across, which usually we think of persuasion as we have to speak to be persuasive. But actually what the research has found is if we want to be persuasive of the other side, we have to help them feel heard and listened to. So that ear symbol, all of these things, any signal we can give to somebody that we've heard them or we're interested in hearing from them, that really takes down the tone and the tension. So we need to offer people more ways of doing that for each other. That's a great question. So yeah, just with Malka at lunch today, we were talking about, sort of like videos, snapshots of seeing somebody to really humanize somebody who maybe has a different point of view than you do on climate change. So what if you just got some profiles of people that maybe it's not everybody sharing all of their experience, but maybe a select group of people with different points of view do make a video and really just share about their identity. So at least in your mind, you don't have those crazy climate deniers and the sort of evil symbol over their head. What if you have 3 examples of people who disagree with you, but you have seen them and heard them and understand, oh, okay, they've come to this position, this idea from a very different point of view, and it maybe makes sense, and wow, they're people that I can relate to by listening to their story. So maybe it doesn't have to be everybody revealing their identity, but some examples.
That makes so much sense, like empathy, building in examples of stories, powerful stories of certain people within an identity group, not that every single individual needs to share their life story.
Yeah.
Can you repeat
So the question is, does personal sharing, specifically about children, really, is there evidence that it really helps with a negotiation? There's not a lot of evidence on this, but there is a World Bank study from Bosnia that looked at groups that came together purely for dialogue versus groups that came together for school educational, like improving their school, or their children's school. And what they find out is dialogue is much more effective in depolarizing people when there is an alternative goal, specifically that has to do with your family and improving their lives. So bringing together people purely for a dialogue, people's defenses are most high. But when you bring, two groups together and they're focused on improving the lives of their children, that motivates them to actually depolarize, get past some of their hatred of each other.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question about where do you begin with a dialogue, for example, on trans and gender-affirming healthcare for trans queer kids. Is that a statement of your question? So what I really think we need, building off of this conference today, is for every school board in the United States to have tools like Polis to enable reaching the numbers of people that we need to reach. So in my children's home school district in Virginia, extremely conservative, lots of debate on bathrooms for trans kids, for example. They have reached an amazing transformation of understanding of the healthcare needs and the inclusive needs through in-person dialogue. But it's not reaching, of course, the thousands of parents in that school district. So some of these processes, you cannot scale dialogue between 20 people to 20,000 people at this point, but that's what we need. So we need the technology to be able to do that. Does that make sense? So I think when people are exposed to the logic and the experiences and the stories, they do change their mind. So there is this evolution that of understanding that happens on these issues. Many people have gone down that on the LGBTQ, like not understanding the issues and opposing them, to hearing the stories and deliberating and changing their mind, but we don't have a scaled way of doing that. Colin. So the question is, what do you call it when the people in an in-person dialogue have gone through this transformation and they have to communicate it to their group that was not part of the small group dialogue? So it's a common dynamic of when negotiation falls apart, right? So that's why in a peace process, you're doing it in an iterative way. In the Philippines, the peace process went, small group meeting in the nation's capital to the districts, back and forth, because developing the Constitution and the agreement takes a lot of convincing and discussion. So we know that we need to build in lots of time, and we call it the accordion of a small process to a large one. The accordion model is going in and out. What I think is interesting, though, with people's transformation of understanding of LGBTQ identities and healthcare needs, et cetera, is this sort of, it's called a spectrum of allies. So not everybody has to move from absolutely opposed to absolutely agreed. You're actually only trying to move people into the next quadrant over in a scale, so that your active opponents are moving to neutral, so that they're not going to fight you on gender-inclusive bathrooms anymore. So you don't need to convince them the whole way. You just need to bring enough doubt into their mind so that they're not going to obstruct a policy like gender-inclusive bathrooms. So the spectrum of allies is a tool that's used often in social movements, actually, but I think it's really helpful for negotiations, too, to just, you don't have to have these miracle conversions of people to your side. But as long as they're stopping opposing you, you can move more policy issues forward. Yeah, so we're dealing this with Afghanistan right now, with the democratic opposition. So there's lots of ethnic groups that are divided among themselves but want democracy and human rights. And then there's the Taliban, which is in power. And the question there is, do you start a dialogue now that includes the Taliban, or do you leave them out until there's more consensus in the middle about what type of vision for the future? Honestly, I feel very conflicted on these questions, because I think that dialogue should be inclusive of the extremes, at the same time, I think you're right that you actually make more progress in developing the bridging ideas when you include just the moderate middle. So I don't know the answer to your question. Yeah. I have not seen any substances like MDMA used in any kind of negotiation. That's the short answer.
Coffee and alcohol.
But, well, and part of my book on ritual and symbol is really, that a fire, a candle, these are symbols. And in the hallways of the UN, when people are smoking cigarettes in the hallway, that's when a lot of the humanizing happens. So smoking cigarettes is, in a way, like smudging. It provides this other context where people talk about other things and, yeah. And certainly in Cyprus, when you're having lots of wine and dancing, this is an altered state in a sense of a lot of humanizing happens there. I mean, this is really the research on citizen assemblies and trying to get representatives from very different parts of a community. So, yeah, I would point you to that literature of like, how do we really get that representativeness? And you're right. I mean, some cultures and some places are much more coherent in their worldviews and in their shared information sources than other places. So
the question is, could MDMA be a helpful technology in bridging and conflict resolution work?
Honestly, I don't know enough about MDMA. I really can't imagine this, how this can be consensual in terms of entering an altered state when you distrust somebody. So, I mean, I think a lot of what conflict resolution and peace building is trying to do is trying to build trust between highly distrustful people. For that reason, no, I can't see it being used. So the question is, what other than the rational, deliberative processes are we missing from the peace building? And that's really what my presentation and Emily's, I think, was trying to get. There's all kinds of these subtleties of what's happening in a negotiation. This is not staying. So from my work and my research, it is the eating together and the symbolic activities that support the deliberation and the problem solving. And so I wonder, I mean, I'm very convinced of the data that polis is very effective in some place like Taiwan. But what I really wonder is in a much more hostile context, whether these kinds of technologies are going to be enough to build the trust and to get people. And that's where I think that, especially when emotions are high and there's been massacres and mass killing in a society, which of course that's happening all over the world. I don't know if the technology can do that, to start to build trust and an ability to solve problems together. And I think we need to remember the other parts of our brain other than our prefrontal cortex. It's a powerful muscle and tool to solve problems, but if we're being hijacked by our fear of the other and our hatred, we have to find these other ways of humanizing the other side. And so I think that is collectively the task of this group that you've brought together, Rose, is to figure out how do we sequence these technologies and package them together for different kinds of conflicts and different societies with different kinds of divisions. Because now is the time for stress testing them and putting together a richer understanding of how might technology support the kinds of offline peace building. So I think there's always going to have to be really skilled facilitators and mediators guiding the process. And I think that really wasn't mentioned very much today, actually, that Polis and Remesh have really strong facilitators and moderators who have a lot of peace building skills that to guide that use of technology. So it's not technology alone that's going to solve this. You're going to need to have a big support.
Mm-hmm. We need a mixed methods approach.
Yes. So what is the difference between deliberation and conflict, and also the scaling of the back and forth between small scale and large scale deliberation. I mean, deliberation is part of conflict transformation, as with my stepladder diagram. But I think what we haven't really talked about very much is these, in severe conflicts like Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, you have people who are traumatized and are deeply emotional, obviously, because they've lost people, and the level of hatred is much greater than in Taiwan or in the UK, where the main examples of where this deliberative technology has worked. And so I think we need to begin preparing to supplement and support the use of this tech in places where there is much greater distrust and less of a readiness to do this. And I think we have to figure that out together, which is really the point of a gathering like this, to make a community of people thinking about these questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Yeah,
I hope we can keep working together to advance this work.
Yeah.